Morning, I'm Pastor Allen, and this is our Sunday morning online Bible study at 9 a.m. I'm glad that you're joining us, and the passage we're looking at is 2 Corinthians chapter 2, verses 12 through 13. Don't forget we have online worship at 10:10 a.m. and also worship here in Paris in the building. And I hope that you'll join us. But if you can't, you're welcome to watch us online, YouTube and Facebook. And I'm glad that you're here. We're only looking at two verses to finish up what we've been looking at the previous two studies on the previous two Sundays. And so we're going to begin with 2 Corinthians chapter 2, verses 12 and 13. Now, when speakers and writers in the biblical times and ancient times, they often told of events leading up to why they were writing. Now, when they communicated, there wasn't television, there wasn't radio, there wasn't any wired communications. Communications only traveled as fast as another person. So if a letter was sent, it only traveled as fast as the person carrying the letter could go. So news was not very fast like we have it today. If something happens on the other side of the world, we know probably within an hour or two, and we have pictures and we can see what's happening. Well, that wasn't available during the ancient times. And so when someone sent a letter, they had no way of knowing if the letter made it to where it was going or if the person made it. And they had to wait for a response the same length of time it took to send a letter, maybe longer, for the person to come back and say, yes, they read the letter and this is what they said, or this is the letter that they wrote in return. Well, Paul had sent this letter, 1 Corinthians, to the Corinthian church, to the believers. And he had sent it by way of Titus. But he had no way of knowing whether the Corinthian believers had received Titus, if Titus had made it there, or if they had received his letter. Now, later on, we'll see Paul will sail from Troas to enter Macedonia, and that's coming in verse 13, take the overland route to Corinth, probably stop in churches along the way, and in the same way Titus would do the same thing. So it was neither a quick or easy journey. Now, verses 12 and 13 here are the final section in the first part of chapter 2. And this is the end of Paul's explanation of why he was unable to come to the church when he had said that he had planned to do so. And so he's given them the reason, part of the reason why, and he's given them a follow-up. And what had happened was Titus was sent to Corinth with the letter. Paul continued to do his work in and around the Ephesus churches, and we know this happened because Dr. Luke tells us this in Acts chapter 19, verse 22. He sent two of his helpers, Timothy and Erastus, to Macedonia while he stayed in the province of Asia a little longer. Then Paul leaves for Troas, most likely because there was a riot caused by a man, a silversmith named Demetrius. Now, Paul had probably already had plans to leave the city. This just caused him to leave earlier. He had already sent Titus on to Corinth, where he had planned on meeting Titus there. And if he couldn't meet him there, he would meet him in Troas, or maybe Philippi. But the end result ended up being is he ended up meeting Titus in Macedonia. And then when he did, he received a good report that the Corinthian believers had welcomed him, Titus, and they had obeyed Paul's letter about discipling the wrongdoer. And that's the first part of chapter 2. That's what we looked at last week and the week before that. And so now we pick up in verse 12. Now when I went to Troas to preach the gospel of Christ and found that the Lord had opened a door for me. Now Troas is a city in far northwest Asia Minor, which is now part of Turkey today. It's across the Aegean Sea from Greece. And Paul had sailed here from Philippi. And Troas is important because that's where Paul had seen a vision of a man from Macedonia asking him to come and help the church there. And so in verse 12 it says, a door was opened for me. And here Paul is reminding us that God is in charge and he provided opportunities for preaching the gospel. And then we see verse 13. I still had no peace of mind because I did not find my brother Titus there. So I said goodbye to them and went on to Macedonia. Now Titus is one of Paul's most trusted co-workers. And we know very little about him. He's not really mentioned in the book of Acts. He is mentioned in Paul's letter to the Galatians, and we learn that Titus was born to Gentile parents. He had accompanied Paul on an early journey to Jerusalem where the leaders of the church, the Jerusalem church, encouraged him, Titus, to be circumcised, which started a big controversy. And Paul refused to allow Titus's circumcision because it would imply that Gentiles must follow the Jewish Old Testament law in order to experience salvation. And we also know throughout Paul's writing, he assigned Titus very significant things to do. And here is one of them. While he's in Ephesus, he sends Titus to Corinth as his representative to address the various challenges and issues in that troublesome church. Well, sometime later, Titus was sent to the Isle of Crete. We know this from the book of Titus, chapter 1, verses 4 and 5, to the region of Dalmatia to assist with the establishment of churches. And Paul only had words of praise concerning Titus's character and pastoral work. And so in verse 13 it says Paul has no peace of mind regarding Titus. Paul had hoped that Titus would meet him at Troas and report that the letter he had sent, the letter of rebuke, had been well received. And when Titus failed to appear, Paul was troubled and concerned. And so as it says in verse 13, so I said goodbye to them. He continued to minister to the church until it was time to go, because he had made a commitment to care for the Corinthian church and to straighten out their problems. So he leaves the church in Ephesus and prepares to go there to help them with their problems. And then it says he went on to Macedonia. Paul first went to Philippi, and then perhaps to Thessalonica or Berea, before Titus finally met up with him. And this was a normal route that Paul took on his missionary journeys. And we find out all of this later in this letter of 2 Corinthians, chapter 7 onward, where Paul gives us more information. And so verses 12 and 13 it begins a new section in this chapter to this letter. Everything before this had been Paul telling about his history with the Corinthians. And now he tells them there's a restless spirit that is not giving him any peace, because he's waiting for the report of how the letter was received by way of Titus. And so beginning in the next verse, which we'll look at next week, and through chapter 7, Paul provides the most complete defense of his apostleship in the New Testament. Then he returns to the report that Titus gives, and his comfort and his joy from all the good things he hears from it. And so these verses tell us these two short verses tell us the care and the concern and the love that we should have for fellow believers, and the trust in God to see all things through. Whether it's difficult times, whether it's easy time, God is going to see all things through. And most of all, if we are faithful, we will see and experience the faithfulness of God in our lives. So we're off to a good start. I hope you've been following along, and read through the rest of chapter 2 during the week, and we'll begin with the next few verses as we continue our study. Don't forget, in person, online, worship service at 10:10 a.m. We're also having a lunch, so if you've been thinking about visiting, today, Sunday, is a good day to come visit, because we're having a lunch, and then we have our annual meeting. You're welcome to come for lunch, stay for the annual meeting, and if not, just come for the lunch and the worship service, and skip the annual meeting if you're a visitor or a guest. Love to have you. Hope to see you. Have a great Sunday.